They found my truck at first light, 7 miles up the Dos Wallops Road, and everything about how they found it was wrong. The engine wasn't just warm, it was still running. Deputy Ross reached through the open driver's door and switched it off himself. Years later, he admitted that was the exact moment he stopped believing they were looking for a missing ranger. The driver's door stood open. My old steel travel mug sat in the cup holder, the dent my 9-year-old son had laughed about still visible near the rim. Coffee was still giving off thin curls of steam. On the passenger seat lay my Green Ranger notebook, already open. Ross didn't touch it. He simply stared at the last page. For almost a full minute, nobody said a word. Finally, I asked him what he was looking at. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked past me toward the trees. Then he quietly said something I've never forgotten. "The truck isn't the strange part." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He pointed toward the ground. "The strange part is that nobody walked away. Only then did I notice it. The ground was soaked from the night's rain. My boot prints led from the driver's door to the front of the truck. Then they simply ended. No return prints, no struggle, no animal tracks, nothing. As if I'd taken one final step. And the forest had decided I no longer belonged to the ground. Ross finally handed me the notebook. The last page wasn't a patrol report. It contained only one sentence. The trail didn't move. The forest did. If this story began the morning they found my truck, you'd never understand what really happened. The truth is, the forest had been warning me for weeks. I just mistook every warning for coincidence. It really started 3 weeks earlier. It starts, really, 9 years earlier. But the part that matters, the part that ends with a warm truck and no footprints, starts 3 weeks before that morning. I gave the Forest Service 11 years. 9 of them on the Olympic, out of the Hood Canal district on the dry eastern side of the peninsula. I'm telling you that so you can check on me if you want. I was a real ranger. Real badge, real reports, real pension I still cash. I've got a truck with too many miles on it, and a son who plays baseball in Shelton. And up until about my 6th year, I would have told you flat out that people who believe in this kind of thing have been either drinking or watching too much television. I want to be honest about how ordinary the Olympic is, because the ordinariness is the frightening part. The Western Valleys, the Hoh and the Quinault, are genuine rainforest, some of the only temperate rainforest in the country. 12 to 14 feet of rain a year, trees going up 250 feet. Everything hung with club moss so thick the branches sag. The eastern side where I worked sits in the rain shadow, drier, more Douglas fir and lodgepole, but it's still big folded country, cut by rivers running down out of the Olympic Mountains that sit in the middle of the peninsula like a wall, and it loses people. It always has. You can step 200 yards off a trail in that understory and turn around and have no idea which way you came, because there are no sight lines, just green in every direction and the sound of water coming from everywhere at once. So when I tell you people vanished up there, your first thought is going to be, well, of course they did. It's rough country. That was my first thought too, for years. That's the box you put it in. Here's what the job actually was, because I want you to feel how normal it was. I came in around 6 to the district office, checked the duty board and the fire danger sign we set out on Highway 101. In summer I ran fire patrol, driving the forest roads with a radio and a Pulaski and a bladder bag, watching for smoke, making sure campers had drowned their fires cold. I cleared trail, chainsaw on the front country, crosscut saw in the wilderness where power tools aren't allowed. I did wildlife survey work, standing dead still in the wet dark before dawn, calling for spotted owls and marbled murrelets, waiting for something to answer. And I supported search and rescue, because somebody was always overdue. Most people disappear because they make one bad decision. Back then, I believed every mystery could be solved if you gathered enough evidence. That belief became the first thing the forest took from me. A wrong turn, bad weather, a twisted ankle. That's what every ranger is taught. Back then, I still believed every missing person had an ordinary explanation. I wouldn't believe that much longer. My district ranger for most of my time was a woman named Carol Fenn, career Forest Service. Sharp, decent, the kind of boss who'd correct you hard and then have your back all the way. My partner in the field was a younger guy named Danny Ortega, ex-Coast Guard, funny, dependable, the best man I ever worked a search with. And then there was Walt Spears. Walt is where this really starts. Nobody ever interrupted Walt. Not Carol, not Danny, not even the district supervisor. At the time I thought it was respect. Years later, I realized it was fear. Walt was past 70 when I met him, technically retired but still around, doing contract trail work and consulting on searches the way some lifers never quite leave. He'd worked the Olympics since the 60s and knew that forest, the way you know your own house in the dark, every drainage, every game trail, every reliable spring. Carol showed him a deference I never saw her show anyone. Once, early on, I watched the forest supervisor himself drive out to our district just to sit with Walt on the station porch for an hour and then leave without looking in on anybody else. I asked Carol about it afterward, and she said, "Walt knows where the bodies are buried." And then she caught herself, and the smile went off her face, and she said, "It's an expression," in a tone that told me it wasn't. Walt took to me because I asked questions and then shut up and listened, which is rarer than it should be. My first summer he rode along on patrols and taught me things you don't get in any course. How to age a bear track by how the edges had crumbled, which springs held through August in the rain shadow, how the afternoon wind pulled down certain valleys so you could smell smoke before you ever saw it. It never once struck me that everything Walt taught me was about the daytime, not until one evening late in that first August, coming down a ridge above the Dos Wallops, later than we should have, when Walt stopped dead on the trail and put his hand flat on my chest. "We need to be at the truck before the light's gone," he said. "Move." I told him we were fine. We had headlamps. It was half an hour down. And he said, in a voice completely unlike his usual dry drawl, "Ranger, in Sector 9, you do not stay out after the second sunset. Ever. Not for a lost hiker. Not for a fire. Not for a hurt kid. You get to a road or a locked building before dark every day of your career. If you learn nothing else from me, learn that." I almost smiled. It sounded like one of those old ranger superstitions every district has. But nobody else smiled. Danny looked away. Carol quietly closed the truck door. That silence stayed with me far longer than Walt's words. Sector 9 was our internal name for a big block of country up the Dos Wallops and Duckerbush drainages, toward the high peaks, rough and lightly traveled. I asked him what the second sunset was. "There's one sunset." He didn't answer. He didn't answer. He just started down faster than a man his age should move, and we made the truck with 5 minutes of grey light to spare, and he didn't say a word the whole drive back. When I dropped him off, he stopped with his hand on the door and said, "You think I'm a superstitious old man? That's fine. Just do the one thing." And he went inside. I did think Walt was a superstitious old man, a likable one. I figured he'd lost a partner once, caught out overnight in weather, and the grief had hardened into a rule. So I kept the rule anyway, not because I believed him, but because getting off the mountain before dark is just good sense. Over that first year, I noticed there were other rules, unwritten ones. Nobody ran overnight patrols in Sector 9, though every other district did spike camps in summer. When I asked Carol, she said it was a staffing decision, and changed the subject so smoothly, I didn't realize until years later it was the only question I ever asked her that she had a polished answer ready for. The working maps for the Sector 9 country got replaced far more often than they should, and the old ones went into a locked cabinet in Carol's office instead of the recycling, and the trail signs up in Sector 9 got maintained more than any others in the district. Replaced on a rotation, even out on trails almost nobody hiked. Danny complained about it constantly, said it made no sense to keep swapping perfectly good signs in country, where you might see one party a month. He was right. It made no sense. There was a rule about whistling too. I learnt it from a seasonal named Kessler, a college kid who'd worked 2 summers before me. We were up in a stand of old cedars. in a place the crews called Cedar Basin, thinning brush off a trail, and I was whistling to myself the way you do. Some song stuck in my head, and Kessler put his loppers down and said, quiet and embarrassed, "You're not supposed to whistle in the basin." I asked why. He said he didn't know, that a full-timer had told him the first week, and he'd just never done it since. He said it the way you'd tell somebody not to open an umbrella indoors, half a joke and half not. And when I laughed, he didn't laugh with me. He just picked his loppers back up and said, "It's real quiet in here. You notice that? Even the birds don't." When we left Cedar Basin, I caught myself whistling again. Only 3 notes. Kessler stopped walking so suddenly I nearly walked into him. He didn't even look at me. He just said quietly, "Don't do that twice." I asked him why. He shook his head. "I don't know. Nobody ever tells you why." Then he started walking again. And it was. I hadn't noticed until he said it, but Cedar Basin was the quietest patch of forest I ever worked. So quiet you could hear your own blood. And there was one more rule, the strangest, and I only learned it because I broke it by accident. I was in the truck one evening running the district radio net, and I keyed up to check in, and when I released the key, I heard my own voice come back over the speaker, saying my own call sign, in my own cadence, a half-second behind me like an echo that shouldn't exist on a simplex channel. Walt was in the passenger seat. He reached over without a word and turned the radio off. When I asked him what that was, he said, "If you ever hear your own voice come back at you on the net, you shut it off. Right then. You don't answer it. You don't listen to what it says next." And that was all he'd give me. For just a second. I almost keyed the microphone again. Walt caught my wrist before my thumb touched the transmit button. I'd never seen him move that fast. His grip actually hurt. He didn't look at me. He kept staring at the radio. "Don't." It wasn't loud, but it was the only time I ever heard fear in Walt's voice. I told myself it was Skip, some atmospheric bounce, a distant repeater catching my transmission and throwing it back. That's a real thing that happens. It happens on flat ground in dry weather, not in a wet river valley at dusk, but it's a real thing, and I put it in the box with everything else. None of this alarmed me at the time. It was a slow drip of small oddities, and I had a whole life pulling at me, a marriage coming apart quietly, a little boy, and too much drinking I was burying in the work. The forest was where I went to disappear from my own life. The idea that it was something other than what it looked like would have seemed, then, like the last thing I needed. Looking back, the forest was almost unnaturally beautiful that afternoon. Blue sky, cold air, the smell of cedar, ravens drifting overhead. Nothing felt wrong. I've noticed something since then. The forest never changes suddenly. It always waits until you trust it. The first time the ordinary broke, I was alone, and there was no drama to it at all, and that's why it took me years to put it down. My 6th autumn, late October, a rare stretch of clear cold weather. An elk hunter called in that his brother-in-law hadn't come back to camp up off the Dos Wallops Road, at the edge of the Sector 9 country, and Carol sent me up to do a hasty search before we escalated. Routine. Overdue hunter, probably holed up under a tree, would turn up on his own. I got up mid-afternoon, talked to the reporting party, and started up a trail to check the obvious spots, meaning to be back at my truck before dark like a good student of Walt Spears. The trail crossed a creek about a mile in, a fast tributary of the Dos Wallops, over a simple stringer bridge, 2 logs and planks, and a single handrail on the downstream side. I knew that bridge. I crossed it, noted the time out of habit, kept climbing, called the man's name into the timber, found nothing, and after 40 minutes, turned around to get down before the light went. And I came to the bridge again. Same bridge, same 2 log stringers, same single downstream rail, same plank with the long split in it. Except I was walking down, and I hadn't reached any junction, hadn't crossed any other water, and that bridge should have been 10 minutes farther down. I stopped. I told myself I'd gotten turned around, though there was nothing to turn around on. It was an out and back. I crossed the bridge. I kept going down. The grade felt right, felt like descending, And after another 15 minutes, I came to the bridge a third time. It wasn't fear yet. It was vertigo, a sick argument between what my legs knew and what my eyes were showing me. I stood on that bridge and looked at the creek, and the creek was wrong. It ran down toward the Dos Wallops, north and downhill, always had. The water under the bridge was moving the other way, uphill, or what every cell in my body swore was uphill. I watched a yellow maple leaf ride the current the wrong direction, upstream, and the ground did a slow, soft roll under my boots though I was standing still. I got out my compass, a good susunto. I trusted the way you trust a compass. The needle wouldn't settle. It drifted slow and even, all the way around and around, like it was tracking something circling me. I pulled my Garmin, and it put my position more than a mile east of any trail, out toward the peaks, and the track line it had drawn of my afternoon was a snarl, folding back over itself in ways I flatly had not walked. And there was one more thing, the thing that put a real cold hand on my neck. The birds had stopped. That country is never quiet. There's always a winter wren going or a raven somewhere, and it had all just stopped, exactly the way Kessler said Cedar Basin was always quiet. And in that stopped silence, I noticed the second set of footprints in the mud beside the bridge, right next to mine, the same tread, the standard issue boot every ranger wore, walking alongside my own prints, and I had come up that trail alone, and the light was going. I'd like to say I kept my head, and I mostly did, because panic gets you killed, and that had been drilled into me. But I felt Walt's hand flat on my chest. I heard him say, "Get to the truck," before the light's gone, and for the first time I understood in my gut that he had not been superstitious about anything. I did the only thing that made sense. I stopped trusting the trail, the compass, the GPS. I found the creek's physical channel, because water is honest, even when it runs the wrong way, and I followed it down by ear and by the drop of the ground, ignoring which way it seemed to flow, until the timber opened, and I came out not on a trail, but on the Dos Wallops Road itself, a quarter-mile from my truck, with the last grey light bleeding out of the sky. The hunter turned up fine at first light, walked into camp on his own. When I asked him what happened, he got a strange look and said the trail had gone wrong, that he'd hiked downhill for hours and kept ending up higher, and then it got dark, so he sat down and waited. He said it the way a man says a thing he expects to be laughed at. I didn't laugh. I wrote it up as a routine recovery. Subject located no injuries, and I put not one word about the 3 bridges or the compass or the second set of prints, and I've wondered ever since how many of the routine reports in that district's files were written by people doing exactly what I did. I told Danny I needed to say it out loud or start doubting my own mind. I laid it all out over beers, the bridges, the compass, the backward creek, the prints. I braced for a joke. Instead, he got quiet, turned his glass around a few times and said, "You want to hear something I never told anybody?" A month before, doing sign work up in Sector 9 toward Anderson Pass, he'd photographed a junction sign for the maintenance log, the brown Carsonite post with routed white numbers, and it read one number. He'd stood right in front of it. When he got back and pulled the photo, the sign in the picture read a different number. Same post, same background, same moss on the same rock behind it. Different number. He'd told himself he misread it in the field and never mentioned it to a soul. Now there were 2 of us, and that's what turned me from a man with a strange story into a man running an investigation. Because one person can be fooled, tired, coming apart the way I halfway was. But Danny had a photograph, and I had a GPS track, and physical evidence is physical evidence, and I am at bottom a stubborn literal man. I started with the maps. I pulled the old USAG 7.5-minute quads going back decades, laid them out chronologically on the backroom table, and traced them onto clear acetate so I could overlay a 1958 quad on a 1979, on a 1997. At first I found nothing, because I was looking for big differences, and the differences were small. The trails moved, not the roads. Roads are surveyed and graded and they hold. But the footpaths through the upper Sector 9 drainages drifted from addition to addition. A trail up the north side of a valley in 1958, climbed the south side in 1979, and a small lake shown on the older quads near Anderson Pass, labeled with a name I'd never heard used. Loomis Lake was simply gone from the newer maps. Not drained, not marked seasonal, just absent. And where it had been the 1997 quad showed a benchmark and the notation of a lookout site, a fire lookout, where a lake used to be. That sent me looking for the lookout, because a fire lookout is a real structure, built by real men who kept real records, and if it existed I could find its logs. It took me 2 weeks of digging through the regional archive requests, but I found it. The Loomis Ridge Lookout, built 1934 by the CCC, staffed seasonally until 1962, then abandoned. And the reason it was abandoned was in a single administrative memo, and the memo said the lookout was decommissioned following the loss of the seasonal observer, and gave no further detail, and the observer's name, when I ran it down through the personnel rolls, was a young man named T. Spears. Spears, Walt's brother, I'd learn later. Walt never told me that directly. I found it in a marriage record and a census sheet. A younger brother, Thomas, who went up to sit that lookout in the summer of 1962 and never came down, and whose disappearance was written up not as a death, but as a decommissioning, a building closed, a lake erased, as if the whole place had been quietly folded up and put in a drawer. I want to be careful here, because there are ordinary explanations for pieces of this, and I reached for every one. Trails get rerouted after washouts, and the Olympic washes out constantly. Old lookouts get decommissioned and forgotten. Lakes silt in and disappear over decades. Cartographers make mistakes. Young men die in the backcountry, and grieving families and tight-lipped agencies bury the details. I told myself all of it, and over those weeks I built a completely rational theory and held it hard, and the fact that it nearly worked is part of the horror. Here's the theory. The Upper East Side had a tangled human history. Logging in the 20s and 30s, small outfits running unmapped spur roads. A civilian conservation corps camp up the Duckerbush in the 30s. The same crews who built the lookout. Old rumors of squatters who moved into abandoned logging structures during the Depression and never came out. Lay all that under decades of sloppy backcountry cartography and constant flood rerouting, and you could explain a great deal. The wrong sign numbers were salvaged signs from rerouted trails, reused, still carrying old designations. The mismatched maps were just different surveys of badly mapped country. The vanished lake had silted in, and the benchmark got placed later. The GPS failure was steep terrain and heavy canopy, which genuinely wrecks reception. The compass was iron in the rock, marine basalt, and there are documented magnetic anomalies through the coast range. The radio echo was skip. The second set of prints could have been an earlier hunter's, or my own from the way up, distorted in soft mud. It fit. It nearly all fit, and for a couple of months I felt the relief of a literal man who has explained away the impossible. I even had a theory about the people Kessler wouldn't whistle around, and the observer who vanished. Squatters, a hidden community, descendants of Depression-era holdouts, living deep in the Sector 9 country off old logging infrastructure, avoiding the Forest Service, occasionally responsible for a lost hiker or a missing lookout. It sounded insane written down, but people have lived hidden in American forests before. It's happened, and it was a human explanation, and a human explanation is a thing you can put a badge and a warrant against. I actually looked for them. I spent 3 of my own days off hiking old spur roads in that country, in daylight, looking for smoke, for cut wood, for any sign of people, and I found old logging junk, rusted cable, and a collapsed shake cabin, and a cook stove full of moss, and no sign that anyone had been there in 50 years, and I told myself they were just deeper in. I took the theory to Walt, partly to prove to myself his warning had a mundane root, and I wanted to watch his face. I found him at the station on a rainy afternoon and laid it all out. The bridges, Danny's sign, the overlaid maps, the vanished lake, the lookout, the squatter idea, the basalt, all of it. I did not tell him I'd found his brother's name. I wasn't ready, and neither was he. He heard the whole thing without a word, looking out at the rain coming down through the big firs. Then he said, "That's a good theory, real good. It's just about the same one I built 40 years ago." Same one the man who trained me had before that. You'll hold on to it for a while. Some men hold on to it their whole careers. The lucky ones do. I asked what he meant. Every single thing you just told me is true, he said. There were logging outfits. There was a CCC camp up the ducker bush. The basalt throws a compass. All of it's true, and not one word of it is the answer. And the reason you built it is the same reason I built mine. Because the true thing is a thing a sane man can't carry in his head all day and still tie his boots in the morning. So he builds a box, and he makes it out of true facts, and he tells himself the true thing is inside it, and he goes home and sleeps. He got up slowly. You keep your box, son. I mean it kindly. As long as it holds, you keep it shut. The box held another year. Then two things happened close together that broke it, and I could never get the lid to sit right again. The first was the marsh search. The second was a box of paper. I'll take the paper first, because it came first, and because it's the part that reads like real investigation instead of a nightmare. Carol went out on medical leave that winter, gallbladder surgery, and while she was gone, the acting district ranger, a transfer from Idaho who didn't know the local customs, asked me to help clear out and inventory the old files, because the office was drowning in paper, and regional wanted it digitized. That's how I got into the locked cabinet, the one where the old maps went. I had a key, legitimately, for the first and only time, and I spent 4 evenings alone in that office, going through 60 years of records nobody had meant for me to read. Most of it was ordinary, but there was a folder, unlabeled, thick, held shut with a rubber band that had gone brittle and snapped when I touched it, and inside it were the patrol logs, not the official ones, the real ones, going back to the 50s, kept by hand, passed ranger to ranger, never turned into regional, the same way that Iraq logbook was passed hand to hand. Except I didn't know about any of that yet. I only knew I was holding something that had been deliberately kept off the record for 60 years, and they told the true story of the fence. Every entry was a night the country had been walked, or a day a hiker had been turned back, or a note about the light. There were dozens of entries about the second sunset, matter of fact, the way you'd log weather, cleared visitors from Anderson Pass Trail, 1710, ahead of second sunset early tonight, 1640, cloud cover, advised all crews off the mountain. They tracked it like a tide, and over the decades the times crept. In the 50s the second sunset, whatever it was, came a good 40 minutes after real sundown, plenty of margin. By the 90s the logs showed it coming 10, 15 minutes after, closing. The window between the sun going down and the thing Walt called the forest opening its eye was getting smaller every decade, and the rangers had been measuring it, quietly, the whole time, the way you'd measure a glacier retreating, knowing you couldn't stop it, and only wanting to know how much time was left. There was a hand-drawn map in that folder too, and it was the single most unsettling document I have ever held. It was a map of the Sector 9 country, careful, detailed, clearly the work of someone who knew the ground, but it had 2 sets of trails drawn on it in 2 different colors of ink. One set matched the daytime maps, the other set didn't match anything, and in the margin, in an old-fashioned hand, someone had written, "Day routes in black, night routes in red. Do not attempt to follow red. There is no coming back the way you came." And below that, a legend of small symbols scattered across the red routes, and beside the legend, the note, X marks where they were found, O marks where they were seen after. There were a lot more O's than X's. I photographed every page of that folder with my own camera before I put it back exactly as I'd found it. I still have those photographs. They are the only physical proof I have that any of this happened, and I look at them sometimes, the crept times, the 2-color map, the O's, and I know it's real because I can hold it in my hand. Then, 3 weeks after I closed that cabinet, we had the Marsh search. Aaron Marsh was a 28-year-old ER nurse from Olympia. Experienced solo backpacker, good gear, real skill. He went in at a Sector 9 trailhead on a Friday in September on a permit for a 3-night loop toward Anderson Pass, due out Monday. When he didn't come out, his wife called it in Tuesday, and we ran it full scale, county sheriff's team, a K9 unit, a Navy helicopter out of Whitby, to fly the drainages. I was on the ground crew. We searched 13 days. After the first 72 hours, the odds fall off a cliff, and by day 13, everyone had privately switched from rescue to recovery. We gridded the whole upper sector. We had the dogs on his scent from his car. We flew every drainage. Nothing. Not a boot print, not a wrapper, not a thread. And I noticed something during that search that nobody else remarked on, because nobody else had seen the two-color map. Twice, in areas we'd already gridded and cleared, the dogs alerted hard on scent, circled, and lost it, in places that on my photographed map fell exactly on a red route. The handler said the dogs were confused by the terrain. I knew where we were standing. On the 14th day, the sheriff scaled it down, and we drove home sick with it. Aaron Marsh walked out on the 22nd day. He walked out at the same trailhead he'd walked in, around 5 in the afternoon, and day hikers found him on the hood of his own car, which had sat in that lot the whole 22 days, with a Forest Service notice on the windshield. I was one of the first up because I was closest, and I want to tell you exactly what I found, because this is where the box came apart for good. Marsh was in remarkable shape for a man lost 22 days. 22 days without food in September high country should leave you near a corpse. He was thin and cold and confused, but nowhere near 3 weeks of starvation. The paramedics, comparing his condition to what they'd expect, put his time out at maybe 3 days, 4 at the outside. His body had lived 4 days. The calendar had lived 22, and his pack was mostly full, days of food he'd never eaten, his water filter clean and bone dry, and his boots, good broken-in leather boots, were barely scuffed. A man does not wander lost for 3 weeks in boots that look like they walked a level nature loop. I sat with him waiting on the ambulance, because he was calmer with me than with the deputies, and I asked gently what happened. He told me, in a reasonable, bewildered, frightened voice, that nothing had happened. He'd hiked in, camped at a little tarn the first night, and the next morning the trail was wrong. He said it just like that. The trail was wrong. It kept bringing him back to his own camp. He'd figured out fast his compass and phone were useless, so he stayed put to wait for rescue, which is textbook. He'd been at that campsite the whole time, 3 nights, he thought, maybe 4, and then he said the thing I've never gotten out of my head. The weird part was, it never really got dark. The sun would go down, and it'd get dark, and then it'd go half light again, grey, wrong, out of the west, and I could see people out in the trees, walking. But they never came when I yelled, and then it'd get dark for real. He gripped my wrist. I never left the trail. Write that down. I never left the trail. The trail left me. He described the second sunset to me without ever having heard the words. Grey light out of the west, after dark. He'd lived what the old logs measured, and he'd seen the O's on the map with his own eyes, the people in the trees. The county wrote it up as a disorientation event and a 22-day survival ordeal, and a very lucky man. His condition got put down to fitness and water he must have found. The people in the trees got attributed to isolation hallucination, which is real and well documented, and I don't blame those doctors. Everybody had a box, but I'd sat next to him, and I'd seen the boots, and I'd photographed a 60-year-old map that predicted every word he said. So I went back to the archives one more time, not to build a comforting theory, but to hunt, and I pulled every missing persons case tied to the Sector 9 country, as far back as the records ran, and I found the pattern, the one no single file shows, the one you only see laid out together, not huge. This isn't a place where hundreds vanish, or it'd be infamous. Rare enough that no ranger in a normal career sees more than 1 or 2. Rare enough to stay a coincidence. But across the decades it was there, in 3 shapes. Some vanished and were never found, clean and traceless. Cases that went cold. Those were the X's. Some vanished and came back, like Marsh, in the wrong physical condition, telling the same story. And a third shape, the one that turned my stomach, the one the map called O. A small number who came back didn't reintegrate, couldn't stay away, kept going back, several of whom eventually vanished for good on a return trip. 1. A man named Harlan Pryor, who'd come out of the upper dukkha bush in 1974 after 9 days, was noted later as preoccupied with returning to the location and was found dead of exposure the following winter, having hiked back in alone, in bad weather, without adequate gear, apparently on purpose. The ranger who wrote that follow-up had added one line that wasn't standard language. It read, "He said it was calling him back. They all say that." The ranger's name was W. Spears. Walt. Of course it was Walt. He'd worked that country half a century, and he'd buried his own brother in a folder marked in red ink, and he'd watched the window close a minute a year for 60 years, and he'd been trying to warn me since the first August I ever knew him. I need to tell you about the day I saw them, because it came before the last conversation with Walt, and it's the reason I finally believed him, and it's the clearest memory I have of any of it. It was a September evening, and I was doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing, coming down out of Sector 9 well before dark, on a trail in the upper Dos Wallips, moving at a good clip with plenty of light in hand. I glanced uphill through the big firs the way you do, reading my surroundings, and there were people walking through the trees, a dozen or so, spread out, moving parallel to the trail, unhurried, all headed down valley the same direction I was. They wore different clothes. Some wore old wool and canvas, the clothes of loggers from 100 years back. A couple were dressed like modern backpackers in bright shells, and one wore a Forest Service uniform of a cut we hadn't issued since maybe the 50s. An old man, and he carried himself like an old man, and where all the others walked with their faces forward, not seeing me, not seeing anything, that old ranger slowed. He turned his head, and he looked at me, directly at me, across 40 yards of timber in the failing light, the only one of them who ever acknowledged that I existed. And he raised one hand, slow, and touched the brim of his hat, the way rangers of that generation tipped their hats to each other on the trail, a courtesy older than any of us. And then he turned back, and he walked on with the rest of them, and the trail bent, and the timber closed, and they were simply not there anymore. No flash, no vanishing, just gone the way a thought is gone when you reach for it. I stood there a long time, and then I did the only thing there was to do. I walked to my truck, before dark, and I drove home, and I looked in on my sleeping son, and I told no one, and I understood, finally and completely, that Walt Spears had been telling me the plain truth for years, and I had been too stubborn and too frightened to hear it. So I went to find him, with my folder of maps and missing persons patterns, and that follow-up note in his own hand, and with the one thing I'd never said to him. His health had gone downhill, and he was staying at a little place outside Quilcene, and I sat in his kitchen while he made coffee with shaking hands, and I told him about the old ranger who tipped his hat, and then I told him I knew about Thomas. He set the coffee down very carefully, both hands, like a man setting down something that might break, and he sat, and for a while he didn't say anything at all. Then he said, "You saw him tip his hat?" Not a question. He does that to me too, every time. 60 years, and he still does that to me, because he was polite, my brother, even up there, even now. His eyes were wet and steady. He was 19. I got him the lookout job. I thought it'd be good for him. A summer up high, save some money for school. I'm the one who put him up there. He didn't look at my folder. He'd stopped needing to. "I'm not going to tell you all of it," he said. "Not because I'm keeping a secret to feel important, because there are things I know I'd give anything not to know, and I won't do to you what got done to me. I'll tell you enough to keep you breathing, and not a word past that. And then I'll ask you to walk away from that country and never look at it again. And you'll say you will, and we'll both know you're lying, because I lied to the man who told me to. I asked him what it was, what was actually out there. Was it in the forest, or was it the forest?" He watched the rain a long while. "You're asking the wrong question, and it's the same one I asked. You keep trying to figure out what's out there. There isn't a what. You want a thing, a creature, a ghost, a door to somewhere, because a thing you can name and point at and maybe get away from. There's no thing." He tapped the table. "The forest hasn't got a monster in it. The forest is the thing. It's not evil, understand me. It's not hungry. It's not angry. It's not any of what you'd need it to be for it to make plain sense. It's just that in that upper country, after dark, the ground stops agreeing to hold still. Space comes loose, time comes loose, and it's slow, and every year it's slower to knit back up in the morning. The daylight holds it down less than it used to. He looked at me steady. You found the logs. You saw the times creeping. You know how long the window is now. That's what your two-color map is. That's what the fence is for. The men above Carol, above the supervisor, the ones who send the new maps every season, they know it's getting worse, and they don't know how to stop it. So they do the only thing there is. They keep people out after dark. That's the job, son. The whole thing. The trail crews, the sign rotations, the no overnight rule, the fire patrols that always come home. It was never about fire. It's a fence made out of rangers. We walk the edge of it all day so we can look a family in the eye at the trailhead and say be back before dark and mean it in a way they'll obey. I asked him about the second sunset. He'd said it my first year and never once explained it. His face changed. That's the thing I hoped you'd never have a reason to ask about, he said. The sun goes down and there's a few minutes of real dark. And then, if you're still out there, the sky comes light again out of the west. Not sunrise. Sunrise is the east and it's warm. This is the west and it's grey and it's cold and it's the forest opening its eye. Once you've seen the second sunset, you've been seen back. Get to the road before it, because after it, the ground you're standing on is not the ground you think it is, and it's had a good long look at you. I asked him about the people in the trees, about his brother tipping his hat, and this is the part I've never been able to shake. Walt went very still. Those are the ones who stayed. The forest doesn't trap people. Trapping would be a kindness, because a trap you can be cut out of. It's worse. It remembers them. Once you've been out there past the second sunset, once it's had that look at you, you're in it. You're part of the ground, part of the map it keeps redrawing, and it can call the rest of you back to sit with the part it already holds. He was quiet a moment. My brother went up to that lookout, and the lake it sat over is gone off the maps now because the forest took the whole place, the lake and the lookout and the boy, and folded it up. And I have seen him maybe 6 times in 60 years, and he has never once looked at another living soul that I know of, except tonight he tipped his hat to you. And son, I wish to God he hadn't, because that means it knows you. That means you're not just seen, you're expected. I told him I'd always made the road. Every time. I'd never stayed out past dark, never seen the second sunset. He looked at me with an expression I can only call pity. The bridge. Your 6th year. 3 times. He knew. I'd never told him the number. How long were you out there past when the light started to go? Really? With the creek running backwards, and the birds stopped, and a second set of prints beside yours. How long? And I realized I didn't know. I remembered the light going amber, then grey, and then I was on the road with the last of it draining out. But the middle, between the 3rd bridge and the road, following the creek down by ear, I had no idea how long that had taken. It had felt like 15 minutes. It could have been 3 hours. My watch, when I finally looked at it in the truck, had shown a time I accepted without question, and I could not now swear to you what it said, or whether it agreed with the sky. Walt watched all of that cross my face. You've already been seen, he said gently, the way you tell a man he's sick. You've been careful, and careful buys you time. It's bought me 60 years. But don't ever believe you got out clean. Nobody gets out clean. You just get out slow. He closed my folder and slid it back to me. Go home. Sit with your boy. Do the job. Walk the fence. And when it starts calling you back, and it will, you remember the wanting to go isn't you. It's the part of you that stayed, reaching for the rest. You don't have to answer it. I never did. But I've had to want to. Every single day, for 60 years. He smiled, and it was the loneliest thing I've ever seen on a human face. That's the real secret. It doesn't take you. It just makes you want to be taken, and then it waits. Walt Spears died that winter, in his sleep, natural causes, 92 years old, which meant he'd started on the Olympic in the 50s, the year before his brother went up the mountain. At his service, the forest supervisor came, and Carol spoke, and two grey old men I'd never seen stood at the back and left without speaking to anyone, and I understood they were more of the fence, from other forests, and I decided I did not want to know how many. After the service, one of them found me by my truck, an old man with a face like weathered cedar, and he didn't introduce himself. He just said, "Walt spoke well of you. He said you'd figured most of it out." I said I supposed I had. He looked at me a long moment and said, "Then you know the only thing left to decide is how you're going to spend the years you've got before it calls loud enough. Some men do good work. Walt did. He kept a lot of families whole that never knew his name, and he tipped his hat, the exact same gesture, and walked away, and I stood by my truck shaking for a reason I couldn't have named. I put in my papers that spring. My knee was part of it, and my heart wasn't in it, but mostly I was afraid, because the wanting Walt promised had begun to come, not strong. A pull on grey evenings, a sense that I'd left something up in that country and ought to bring it home, a restlessness that thickened as the light failed and eased when the sun was up. I knew it for what it was. I moved down near my son in Shelton, an hour from the forest, close enough to visit and far enough that I never did. And that would be the whole story, except for the last 3 weeks, the ones I mostly can't account for, the ones that end with a warm truck and no footprints. I don't remember deciding to go back. That's the honest truth, and it's the worst part. What I remember is that the wanting stopped being a pull on grey evenings and started being the only thing in my head. I remember not sleeping. I remember standing in my kitchen in Shelton at 2 in the morning with my truck keys in my hand and no memory of picking them up. I remember my son asking me what was wrong and not being able to answer him, and the fear in his face, and being unable to make my mouth explain that his father was slowly being called somewhere he could not follow. I remember the radio in my truck coming on by itself one night in the driveway, just static, and under the static, faint, my own voice, saying my old call sign. And I remembered Walt's rule, and I ripped the fuse out with my fingers and sat in the dark, breathing hard. I remember thinking, over and over, in a voice that was mine and also somehow not, that I had left something in Sector 9 and it was time to go get it. Walt's voice came to me. The wanting to go isn't you. It's the part that stayed reaching for the rest. And I held on to that for 3 weeks. And then one evening I didn't. The last thing I truly remember is driving up Highway 101 with the sun going down over the peninsula, red and low in the west, and turning onto the Dos Wallops Road, and thinking, clearly, with something like relief, that I'd be back before dark. That's all. That's the edge of the hole. After that, there's nothing, until the phone call the next morning telling me my own truck had been found 7 miles up that road, with the engine warm, and the door open, and my coffee still steaming, and no tracks leading away. They found me, in case you're wondering. I want you to know that, because otherwise this is just a story about a man who vanished, and I'm still here. 2 days later, I walked out of the woods at a trailhead 11 miles from my truck, in remarkable physical condition for a man missing 2 days, thin and cold and confused, my boots barely scuffed. I don't remember any of it. The county wrote it up as a disorientation event and a very lucky man, and a doctor put my missing memory down to stress and exhaustion, and everybody had a box, and I let them, because what was I going to say? But I know now what happened in that hole, because I've read enough of the logs and buried enough of the people to know the shape of it. I went up there and I stayed past the second sunset. I saw the grey light come out of the west. I walked with them, the loggers and the backpackers, and the old ranger in the 50s uniform, for what my body counted as 2 days, and what the calendar might have counted as anything at all. And then, for reasons no one has ever been able to explain to me, unlike Thomas Spears, unlike Harlan Pryor, unlike the long column of O's on that map, I came back out. I got out slow, the way Walt said. I don't know why it let me. I've stopped asking. I only know that a part of me did not come back, that a part of me is still up there walking parallel to some trail in the failing light, and that the rest of me can feel it, on grey evenings, reaching. I resigned for good, in the sense that I stopped even visiting. I don't drive to the peninsula anymore. On grey evenings I keep every light in the house on, and I sit with my son, and the wanting is quieter now, most days. and I have almost convinced myself I got out slow instead of not getting out at all. Then, last week, the package came. Small box, no return address, postmarked from Quilcene, which is where Walt died and where nobody I know still lives. Inside was my old Ranger notebook, the green field log, the one that was found open on the passenger seat of my truck that morning, the one the county took as evidence and, they told me later, lost somewhere in a records transfer, the way things get lost. I turned it in. I never had it. And there it was on my kitchen table. I sat with it a long time before I opened it. I paged through 9 years of my own handwriting, the whole ordinary record. Trail cleared, owls surveyed, subject located, no injuries, up to the last real entry, the one line I wrote and don't remember writing. The trail didn't move. The forest did. And then there was one more entry after it. It was a full patrol report. In my hand, my particular lowercase g, the way I cross my sevens from an old habit. It was dated 6 months ahead of the day the package came, a day that has not happened yet. Weather, clear. Location, Sector 9. And it described, in calm professional language, a routine evening patrol of the upper dose wallops, and a dozen figures observed moving through the timber, and it noted that they had at last acknowledged the reporting ranger, and that the reporting ranger had tipped his hat to a young man in an old uniform who stood at the head of the column, and it closed the way I closed every report I ever filed, with the time and the conditions and my initials. And then, below the sign-off, in the same hand, dated for an evening 6 months from now, one more line that is not the way any Forest Service report has ever ended. The forest finally remembered my name. That concludes tonight's file. If you've ever experienced something strange or unexplained, I'd love to hear your story. You can share it in the comments or send it to the email in the description. It might become a future case on Midnight Files. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, subscribe and join me for more documentary-style horror stories. Until next time, stay curious. And remember, sometimes the things we can't explain are the ones we never forget.